Hi, I'm Pete and welcome to Just a Few Acres Farm. Today we're going to put the belt pulley and PTO unit back in the Super C and hopefully get the transmission lid on all buttoned up. I have all the parts cleaned and ready. I've got my new seals and bearings over here. But before we get going, I got a little story to tell about getting this thing apart. This is the housing that the PTO shaft goes through, and this is the final drive side, the side that bolts on the case. This is the shaft that got pulled out, and you may notice that it's got some damage done to it. It sits in here like this, and there's a pair of bearings that goes down in there, and then the seals on the other side. And then this gear sits on the shaft in here and drives off the long shaft that comes out of the transmission. Well, when it came time to pull this gear off, I figured I'll just put a 3-jaw puller on here and pull it off of the shaft. And this thing would not come apart. It has to pull off this way when it's in the case because the shaft has to drop out the other end, due to the way that the shaft is stepped and the way it engages the bearings. Anyway, I put my 3-jaw puller and tried to pull on it. I couldn't pull it, so I brought it over to Dad's shop. We heated it up red hot with a rosebud, hoping the expansion would pull off. Put the puller back on and stripped the threads on the puller, so that wasn't working. What we wound up doing is going in from this side, peeling out the seal, which is about that wide. That was a job. And then sticking the torch in here and blowing the balls out of the bearings so that we could slide the shaft out. What a job. So then we had this still as a unit, gear and shaft. Put it in my dad's press. It's probably almost 100 years old. It's a giant thing. And pressed it out like this. Now, what we saw after we pressed it out was this shit. Dad put this in the lathe to try and clean it up, but it was all buggered up around here. It actually pulled the metal out of the inside of the pulley when it got pulled out. I thought, boy, that can't be right. So Dad chucked this PTO shaft into his lathe and spun it, and it turned out the whole shaft was bent. Something really forceful has happened to it. You can tell by the wear on it here. And the PTO shaft actually bent. That's why it was all bound up in the gear. So there was no way that we were going to get the old shaft and the gear back together tight, because in order to get them cleaned up, we were going to change the diameters of them, and they never would have fit together right. I got on eBay, and fortunately there was a whole bunch of salvaged PTO units still together. So I got this unit. This case wound up being better because we'd beaten the snot out of the old one trying to get the gear out. And then I got the new shaft and gear inside of it. And when I went to pull this one off, I took the nut off that retains it and just stuck my hand in here in the case and just pulled it right off. So it didn't even need a puller. The things we go through for these, what we think are going to be little jobs. I probably spent half, 3/4 of a day on this. And the reason I went to the trouble of pulling this all apart is because this seal is really hard to replace without pulling the shaft out. Plus these 2 bearings down in here, I wanted to make sure they were good because I plan on using this tractor for PTO work sometimes when I'm done. And as you know, once you start banging on things, you got to get them apart, because once you start banging on them, you worry about hurting the seals and the bearings, and so you're committed. I should have been committed after that job. So anyway, after all that talk, I've got a set of new bearings, and they're the first thing to go in this. And first we got one that goes in this side. This is the side that the shaft pokes out of. I'm going to have to set that. So there's that one way down in there. That's actually how thick the seal was. Boy, they don't make them like they used to. And then we've got a spacer that goes in here that holds the 2 bearings apart. And we have another bearing that's the same that goes on outside of that. Just going to lube it up here. Set that one in. Oh, that's an easier fit anyway. Then we want to make sure that the shaft will go in. It should. Yep, that's fine. But before we put the shaft in permanently, we want to put the seal on, and I kind of screwed up on this. Usually I put 2 seals, 2 of these in a row on the PTO, and then I put grease in between the space. I did that on the MD. I only ordered 1 for this one because I figured it sits up higher and it's not got as much oil pressure behind it all the time, but in hindsight I should have got 2 of them. Well, be that as it may, we're going to set this in. make sure it fits here first. Goes on right. Yep. And there's no wear on that shaft, so we're not dependent so much on exactly where we put the seal. I guess if this ever does leak after the shaft's in, things are all done, I can always put something around this and drive it in further and add a second one on top of it. That's a good plan. Now we can oil up the shaft a little bit so it rides in the seal all right. Actually put some oil on the outside of it here so it slides through the bearings a little easier. And it's got to go in from this way. Yeah, sometimes you got to give it a tab. Now our spacer fell out, so we can put that back in and then put the inner bearing in. Spinach. Spinach. Feels nice and tight. Now we can put the gear on the inside that I had so much trouble with the other one getting off. There's a key on it. Then this gear goes on the shaft. Get the key centered in here. And then there is the retaining washer and bolt. 5/8. What's a 5/8 supposed to be 9/16? On things that will spin, such as this shaft, sometimes the impact wrench is easier to get bolts seated down because it hammers on instead of spinning them. Next on is the drive shaft that drives the whole thing out of the transmission, and that slides in from the back side. This is kind of funky, but I'll show you how it goes together. We'll get it through here. You see that gear drives the gear that I just put in. And then on this side, this is what mates up with the belt pulley here. This is the bevel gear that drives the belt pulley this way. And you've got this really weird arrangement. There's 3 mounting rings, and then there's an O-ring that goes in here that seals it to the belt pulley case. So I think we'll get that on first and get this secured in place. So we'll get this set in here. Go in. You gotta go in straight. I don't like you very much, you know. You've taken up too much of my time. I'm going to start billing you by the hour. There we go. This has a little play in it, so I'm wondering how it's going to seat in the belt pulley housing. We'll test fit it. Alright, I don't have these tightened down all the way. I don't have the O-ring in. See, it's got a seat in this right here. That appears to seat all right. They're centered in there. We got no wiggle in there. I guess we're good. I'm going to wait to put the O-ring on this till we get ready to put the belt pulley on. The next step is to put on the sleeve that actuates the belt pulley, comes into the counter shaft in the transmission. We got to get the linkage all together on the actuating lever that pushes. Whoops, that's back. Oh no, I put that in. I had to go in first. Oh, I have to take it back apart. Back out come the bolts. You know, these things happen. They always go together quicker the second time though. So in here, see, we've got to put the linkage in here before we put the shaft in, because it's got to sit down in there. Maybe we can get it in. Nope. Got to pull the shaft out. And this sits down in here like this. And you'll see how it works. But before we put it in, we got to put a new seal in here. Here's new seal. And just by the way, if anybody ever thought that a PTO is just a shaft sticking out of the back of the tractor, that's the parts diagram for the PTO of the belt pulley. There's a lot to this thing. Now this is what turns the PTO on and off, slides the shaft backwards and forwards. This little pin goes in a collar that you'll see later. On the other side of this plate are 2 little indentations, and that's for the spring to seat in as this moves. So we're going to go ahead and put that spring in if I can find it. And then with a little oil, here's a little thing that works on the indentations. And then here on the side, we've got a plug that adjusts the tension or compression on the spring so you get a good positive engagement. And we won't adjust that all the way till we're done, but I just want to get it in here. Pop it, that's what it's called. Now we can slide this back in, and before I bolt it down, I want to put this sleeve on and get this linkage set in here, because I got to turn this way out to get it in. See how it rides in this little collar here? Oop, got to push the poppet back in. Like that. And then we can go back and put these back in. So here's that PTO assembly all ready to mount on the back of the tractor. On to other things. Namely, the belt pulley portion of the assembly. Here's what the case looks like. This is the side that faces where I was messing around with that O-ring and putting those bolts in around the spur gear or bevel gear on the PTO, and that bevel gear drives this bevel gear in here. And like all bevel gear setups, we've got shims. There's shims that go on this face to shim this one gear in and out, and then there's shims that go in here to push this gear in and out as well. I did not take this completely apart. If I slide this shaft back and you look down in there, there's a roller bearing in there, which seemed to be just fine when I checked for play. The only way to get this whole shaft out is there's a giant soft plug here on this side, and you would drive that out and then put the shaft back in. But since everything looked fine and I don't have a soft plug that big and didn't want to go looking for one, we're just going to put it back together as is, all cleaned up. And of course, first step in that process is to put a new seal in the retainer that goes on the very outside where the shaft comes through for the belt pulley. We've been putting in a lot of seals lately. Then we can put the bearing in, which I left in its retainer. I'm not replacing it. I don't think this belt pulley had much use at all. Everything's as tight as can be. And this is the shims to locate the bevel gear inside. We got to get them all lined up. And there's an oil drain hole here in the side of the shims, so you got to line all of them up. Drop them a few times, it always helps. There's the oil drain hole in the housing, so we got to line that up. And we have a gasket that goes on here. And before we put the cover on here with the seal in it, we have a spacer that goes inside the seal and fits around the shaft. Oil drain, oil drain. On you go. This sleeve covers up the belt pulley splines. The belt pulley would normally be mounted on here, but since there's no belt pulley, this blank off covers them, and then there's this washer that holds everything together with a bolt. Finally, on this belt pulley, we got a couple plugs here, a drain plug and a fill plug for oil. It's oiled from the transmission, but if you choose when you change the oil to put some in here so that it has a ready supply, you can do that. I'll never be taking these out again, that's for sure. So I'm using some thread seal instead of PTFE tape. Made a big mess. Clean that up. And a little plug here on the other side. It smells delicious. Next, when I was looking at the gasket set that I had for this, I realized I forgot to put a gasket in here, under here. Third time's a charm, I guess. Take it back apart. These things happen, you know. We do it right because we do it twice or thrice. And this gasket has to go on here. You've seen this before. Well, you get in there. You gotta mesh with the teeth. There you go. My gosh, you've given me more problems. At this point, I think I have the belt pulley and PTO ready to put on the tractor, but first we gotta put in the tube that feeds them oil. we're just gonna seat this. We'll put the PTO in first, put the gasket on it here. Let's get that fit up into the transmission. And we've got 2 bolts to go in here. One on the bottom. Now then, for the belt pulley, we've got a couple shims in here that position the bevel gears in the correct relationship, just like a rear end, remember? So I'm going to put these bolts in here to keep them in place. No gasket here between the two, just these shims. Then we have to put the new O-ring in here that seals one case to another. I guess that's why we don't need a gasket on the shims, because the seal's made here. Well, get on there. There we go. That's right. And we can fit the belt pulley on. They did make a version of these where this is just a blank off plate if you didn't want a belt pulley. There was just like a hump blank off that went on here. Belt pulleys were definitely not used as much in 1953 when this tractor came out as they had before. Well, let's see how she works. I'll just put this control arm in here temporarily. Spin her over. So right now the PTO is disengaged in the belt pulley. And pull it back. We have spinach. We've had spinach all along the way. I'm starting to feel like Popeye. We're just about at a major milestone here, closing up the whole rear end transmission final drive of this tractor. I got one more thing I got to take care of. You may remember that the very first thing I did before I pulled any of this transmission apart was I cut this rivet out that goes in this hole. And all that rivet did, if I can get it in here, was hold that gear from moving back and forth this way and this way. And it was kind of funny because the rivet was quite a bit longer than the shaft that it went through, so it hung out one end by about 1/2 inch, and then it had a big flattened off end on it. And I think that's so it could move back and forth a little bit and wear on multiple surfaces. But I really don't think it takes that much stress. So I put the calipers on it, and it's 3/16. That's the pin size. And I debated either using a number 10 machine screw in here, which is slightly less than 3/16, or a 3/16 inch cotter pin. And I think I'm going to go with the 3/16 inch cotter pin. I just got to flatten this off here a little bit on this end. The way that I see it, whatever's in here doesn't take very much force, because this gear is never moving from where it is. It's always just spinning in place here. Make sure that head clears, and it does. And a 3/16 inch cotter pin is probably equivalent to that old rivet, I would say. I don't know. I think so. I think it'll work. Just going to lock this in 2 gears here. And we'll bend this over. Cut it off and make sure to catch the end that comes off. After probably 70 years, that rivet that was in there had really no wear on it, so I'm not concerned about this wearing. Let's see how that spins. It's got plenty of clearance with its neighboring gear. That's why the rivet was able to hang out so far, because it actually falls between the gear teeth when it rotates around the head here. It's in there nice and tight, so I'm sure it'll be fine. So we can move on to getting the lid on this transmission. I use Permatex Right Stuff for the gasket. Make your own gasket. Works great. Just got to get this cleaned off first. Make sure all the bolt holes are clear of any old debris. We want to take one more look in here and make sure we've got everything the way we want it to be, because we're going to close it up. We want to center these gears as best we can in the neutral position to make it easier to put the lid on. So I'm centering it between the two gears that it goes into. That one there. And that one, we'll just push that reverse. There's the other fork receiver there. Kind of get it out a little bit. And then we want to make sure our lid here is in neutral. Because in neutral, each of these forks is halfway along its travel. Let's see, let's look at the reverse fork though. Reverse and neutral is back, just like I thought. So we're all set with that. Go ahead and put our gasket maker on. Now this cover really isn't that heavy, so I'm going to set it on by hand. Getting the forks aligned is just a challenge, that's all. Which way do you need to go? I believe I'm where I need to be. All the forks seem to be working. Now we got a whole bunch of bolts to put in. Where are you? You're 5/8. You should be 9/16. You should know by now. Where did my 9/16 go? Ah! I got the bolts all tightened down, so I'll give you a look. Here's the back. Coming around. And here's the next job. It's great to have the back half of the powertrain done. Ready for paint. Now we're going to attack the engine. And that's where we'll be with the next video. I hope you enjoyed this one. It's great to get this part back together. I'll see you next time.